that a strong comment?
Thanks. First, I give a lot of credit to the LDP for this invitation because intellectual property is just not spoken of very much and has a pretty solid tendency to glaze an audience over the moment it comes up. And that's entirely understandable, but it does make this issue a little bit dangerous because it's allowed one side of this debate to be absolutely dominant up until now. And that's not a recipe for balance. And laws have come about through treaties and through domestic bills in the US and other countries that almost would have seemed like dystopian science fiction 15 or 20 years ago. And it's in large part due to a certain amount of disconnection in the public from this issue. Some of these laws, for example, allow copyright holders to monitor private communications, not just at the surface level, but through deep packet inspection. These are laws which cannot coexist with a right to privacy. Team that up with 3 strikes laws on top of that, which are laws that allow people to be disconnected from the internet on the basis of accusations, and you have basically a recipe for abuse of the general public by small interest groups. Now, how did we get to that point? A large part of it is because copyright is very poorly understood. And in Europe, a lot of countries just sort of woke up as if waking up in the woods and wondering how they got there. And our party was founded by a chap called Folkvinger in Sweden who had come to a sort of realization that copyright law and enforcement in its modern form had gotten incompatible with what are sometimes called negative liberties, which is freedom from external interference and constraint. Copyright is not the right to exploit a work. It's the right to constrain everyone else from being able to make money from it. It's very different to how it's usually portrayed, and it requires obviously a significant amount of state intervention into free markets, which is justified with very noble sounding reasons, as state interventions always are. But it's on us and on everyone to not make that the default. State intervention shouldn't be the default. It's something that should be scrutinised carefully. And that's been lacking seriously, and that's how, in a sense, we got to where we are. I might put a chart up. This chart is showing the change in copyright duration over time. When it came in, that's the red box down there, it was 14 years, which is quite reasonable. You could extend it for 14 years as well after that, after which the work went into the public domain, where it could be built and used by others, and that was a healthy setup. But you can see the progressive extension in copyright. It tends to correlate to approximately the time when characters like Mickey Mouse are about to enter the public domain, and then there's some pressing reason why it's got to be extended again, and it always happens. And each extension has been accompanied by talk of the need to balance rights of different people, as though this was balanced, as though progressively eroding or moving in one direction was the most balanced thing that could possibly happen. Now, we have come to a situation where copyright lasts for 70 years after the artist that created the content has died. Now, originally copyright was supposed to protect the artist, so you'll have to say it's moved away from that purpose a little bit. And what it allows, in a sense, is perpetual reuse of content. When you have durations like this, anyone that owns content can basically recycle it every couple of years. There's no need to engage in the creation of new content, which is much more expensive. So in a sense, what we have is copyright as a mechanism for non-creation of content rather than creation. This is a slightly more complex chart. The point of it is, if you went to Amazon.com right now, you would see as many books in publication and for sale written in the 1880s as the 1980s. And the fact is that 8 times more books were published in the 1980s. And the upshot is that recently written books are not being republished because the copyright constrains it from happening. And all that needs to happen then is that the copyright holder maybe can't be found, or there's more than one copyright holder. And the effect is that if you look back about 100 years, almost all the work during that time is much less likely to be republished. You have more chance of getting a book written in the presidency of Chester Arthur than in the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And this is happening. The laws that bring this about are the laws that are meant to promote our cultural growth. So you'll have to say that this is an intervention in the free market that's not working as intended. Not the only one of its type, but quite notable for the degree of failure. The best research we have suggests that 15 years is probably the optimal copyright duration. You get a reasonable time in the public domain. Most books make 98% of their revenue in the first 15 years, and then it's in the public domain and it can be republished, and this doesn't happen. So the first step, probably, to getting copyright back to where it should be is to cut down the duration back to where it was in the historical setting. The second step is, I'll come to that, is to recognise the nature of culture. Culture is something that's inherently participatory, and it's always been distributed, from cave paintings to the poems of soldiers that were sent to the trenches in World War I, all the way to people wearing quotes on their clothing. As long as we've existed, we've shared and distributed culture, and this evil thing called file sharing is really just a modern manifestation of that. And it's, for the state to regulate against it is a very modern notion that cultural sharing is something that's got to be stopped. And the more basic and elemental the human drive you want to curb, the more abusive and overreaching the law has to be to enforce it. So that is why you can't stop file sharing in a world where private communication exists. You have to be able to monitor what everyone's doing and prosecute people who are communicating in ways that you don't like. So that's a really serious threat. It's being pushed through a bunch of treaties. It's being legislated through domestic law. There's a lot of pressure. I think David will be hearing from people who want this kind of thing once he's in the Senate, and it's our hopes are with him that he will defend liberty in no uncertain term and send those people packing. Thanks. Now, that's probably a bit hard to see, sorry, but use any research not from the recording industry, and you'll see that there's a lot less of a problem with artist revenue than is made out to be. The red line at the top there is the revenue from recorded music. The line underneath it, the blue line, is the revenue from live music. So what we've got is not a disappearance of revenue from the creative industry, but just a shift in the type of revenue they get. Live music's a good revenue source because it is an enabler of new talent, and it is a direct relationship between artists and fans without middlemen. The middlemen are obviously not happy, but there's no crisis to solve here that requires the violation of liberty. Now, we also need to protect, in addition to liberate the public from the threat of copyright law, we have to allow non-commercial distribution of copyrighted material, which is the sharing of culture. That must happen. On top of that, we should probably try to protect artists as well. I don't know who has heard of the rather nutty case where the band Men at Work was sued successfully, mind you, by Larrikin Music. About 4 seconds of music was too similar to 4 seconds of music from a song called Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree that was written in 1934. They were sued, and they were beaten. That's a lovely little minefield for anyone writing a song. Don't write anything that resembles any song written in the last 100 years, or you can be sued. That's how copyright enables the creative process. Now, go back even further. I mean, Shakespeare was not the first guy to write a play called King Lear. He remixed it. He took work that had been already out there and changed it and refined it and produced the greatest literature that our culture's probably ever produced. Modern day copyright cops and lawyers would have piled on him before he could stick a toe in the Globe Theatre. It would just never happen under modern law. So we must allow, firstly, the sharing of culture, and secondly, its remix. So there's some more studies. I'll send this around if anyone wants it. Protect fair use, that's the second thing that must happen, and that will remove at one stroke the threat to liberty that copyright promotes. Now, we can go further in some areas. There's a thing called Crown copyright, which is copyright on government work. As it's a copyright on government work, you can be reasonably sure that's not going to protect anything artistic or creative. There's no basis for it, okay? It's denying taxpayers' rights to material they funded. It does no other job than that. It should come to an end. Moral rights we don't think should change. Those are important and they don't pose any threat to anyone. It's perfectly appropriate to acknowledge who wrote a work. There's one more issue which you guys will have to adjudicate on in particular, which libertarians can't avoid. And that is where you draw the line between, in the clash of rights, as it were, between intellectual property and private property, to illustrate that clash. If I sell you a chair, you own that chair and I can't tell you what to do with it. You can put it where you want, you can chop it up for firewood, you can make another chair like it, whatever you like. But if I sell you a DVD, there's a law that says I can tell you what to do with it. You can't format change it. You can't transfer it onto your computer. You can't play it in certain regions. You can't play it in certain DVD players. And I am given the right to do this by a section of the Copyright Act called the Technical Protection Measures, which enables something called digital rights management. That's bad enough, but it's also spreading. You can now buy cars with batteries, and the battery will tend to track you, and I, as the seller, will have the authority to shut that battery off if you do something I don't like. So this is a pretty serious threat and a very extreme position to take in the clash between intellectual property and private property. And what's probably needed here is a pretty firm pushback on the side of private property to try and rebalance that. I'll probably skip over. I'll skip over patents.
I'm fascinated. I don't want to cut this fellow short. So.
I could talk about patents, but perhaps I'll spare you.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll just have a little story of my own first of all. I've been going through with my wife a lot of the records that have been collected over the years by her parents, both now passed away, and some of them are interesting, not anything collectible, but it's interesting to go through the old vinyls and to know that they are ours, to be passed on to our children and grandchildren. Not that they might have anything to play the vinyl records on, but it's still historically their record collection. They're part of their life, and apparently now if you download and pay for a collection of records, you cannot pass that to anybody. Is that?
That's true.
Yep.